All right, good morning and welcome everyone. My name is Craig During. Just wanted to give you guys a little heads up that we're still letting people join our meeting, so we're going to give it about a minute to let everybody log on. And it looks like we have, well, we still got more coming in. All right, I think we're ready to go. I think we've got most everybody that's registered for the event. So again, good morning and welcome to our public workshop. Today's meeting is scheduled to discuss incorporating a zero-emission credit pooling concept for the Advanced Clean Trucks regulation. This regulation was adopted in California in 2020 and requires manufacturers of medium and heavy-duty vehicles to sell an increasing percentage of their annual California sales as zero-emission vehicles. This workshop is part of a recent agreement between CARB and the truck and engine manufacturers, better known as the Clean Truck Partnership. The purpose of today's meeting is to present a pooling concept that would allow zero-emission vehicles sold in one state to count for compliance in another state that has adopted California's Advanced Clean Trucks regulation. There are currently 8 states that have adopted the ACT regulation, and others are actively considering as well. As I mentioned, my name is Craig During. I am managing the efforts for the Advanced Clean Trucks regulation. I am joined by several of my colleagues today, including Tony Brazil, Branch Chief of the Transportation and Clean Technologies Branch, Jerry Baruman, Manager of the On-Road Compliance Assistance Section, Paul Arnasia, Air Resources Engineer and lead staff for this regulation, and others who will introduce themselves when called upon throughout the workshop. We will also be joined today by a panel of industry experts and other state representatives who will be introduced shortly. Before I begin, I want to let everyone know that this meeting is being recorded and a copy of this recording will be made available on our Advanced Clean Trucks website. Meeting materials, including all copies of the presentations you'll see today, will be available on our website as well. However, the presentations have not yet been uploaded. We hope to have them available as soon as possible. Today's meeting is scheduled to end at 11:30 a.m. and our intention is to allow for full and open communication. Participants who wish to ask a question or make a comment can do so using the raise hand feature on their Zoom platform. When called upon, you will need to unmute your microphone before speaking, and please introduce yourself by first stating your name and affiliation before making a comment. And also note that the chat feature in Zoom is not available for this meeting. Okay, with that said, let me introduce our first presenter today, Paul Arnasia, who will provide some background information and an overview of today's workshop topics. Paul?
Thank you, Craig. Good morning. So, slide. So given the overview for the day, first I'll provide the presentation providing background on advanced clean trucks and credit pooling. We'll then hear from our guest presenters, and then we'll have time for open Q&A from our audience. To start, California, the majority of Californians live in the areas of poor air quality, with a disproportionate impact on low-income and disadvantaged communities. In California, these challenges are particularly acute in the San Joaquin Valley and South Coast air basins. Major reductions of oxides of nitrogen and fine particulate matter are needed to achieve federal ambient air quality standards. Even as older, more polluted trucks are removed from the fleet and cleaner trucks are produced, additional emission reductions are needed. We want to add that this is not an issue unique to California, as there are many areas across the nation suffering from poor air quality, including the Northeast Corridor, Colorado's Front Range, and many major metropolitan hubs. California has also set aggressive targets to mitigate the impacts of climate change. Transportation makes up the largest share of the state's greenhouse gas emissions encompassing more than half the state's inventory, including upstream emissions from fuel production. The governor and legislature have set goals for greenhouse gas reductions, including full carbon neutrality by 2045. California has also established clean electricity targets, aiming to decarbonize the state's electricity grid by 2045. I'll now cover the advanced clean trucks regulation, a key component of the state's air quality and climate change strategy. The advanced clean trucks regulation was adopted in 2020 and ensures the supply of available zero-emission trucks will continue to grow in the upcoming years. It requires medium and heavy-duty vehicle manufacturers to sell zero-emission vehicles as a growing percentage of sales starting in 2024. Partial credit is available for near zero-emission vehicles or plug-in hybrids with minimum all-electric range. The regulation also contains a number of flexibility provisions, such as the ability to bank and trade credits. The advanced clean trucks regulation is critical to protect the health of Californians. While trucks only make up roughly 6% of the vehicles on California's roads, they are responsible for a quarter of transportation greenhouse gas emissions and a third of statewide NOx emissions. Class 7 and 8 tractors in particular make up a disproportionate share of emissions burning communities near freight hubs. These trucks are only about 12% of the total truck population, but represent nearly half of daily NOx emissions. Now to provide an update on the advanced clean trucks regulation, based on the information reported in 2021 and 2022, manufacturers are currently roughly 2 years ahead of compliance with the ACT regulation and have sold enough ZEVs to meet the 2024 requirement. The ACT regulation contains a number of flexibility provisions for manufacturers. This includes the ability to generate early credits beginning in 2021 model year, the ability to bank and trade credits between manufacturers, and the ability to carry a deficit forward for a model year. In a workshop held on December 13th, we discussed adjustments to the advanced clean trucks regulation, which will provide manufacturers additional flexibility. When it comes to the advanced clean trucks regulation, California is not alone. 9 other states have adopted the ACT regulation, with New Mexico being the most recent addition. These states show a growing commitment to foster a zero-emission truck market by ensuring an adequate supply of zero-emission vehicles to support fleet demand and infrastructure build-out. To provide some data, this slide shows a portion of the truck market represented by states which have adopted the advanced clean trucks regulation, based on both registrations and sales. Together, these states make up roughly 25% of the US trucking market, representing a significant portion of total trucking sales. In July 2023, CARB announced a Clean Truck Partnership Agreement with the nation's leading truck manufacturers that advances the development of zero-emission vehicles for the trucking industry and provides flexibility for manufacturers to meet emission requirements while reaching the state's climate and emission reduction goals. This agreement marks a commitment from the manufacturers to meet California's vehicle standards that require the sale and adoption of zero-emission technology in the state, including complying with the 100% zero-emission sales requirement by 2036, set forth by the recently adopted Advanced Clean Fleets regulation, regardless whether any other entity challenges California's authority to set more stringent emission standards under the Federal Clean Air Act. Today's workshop is a part of this commitment from CARB and the trucking manufacturers. Next, I'll provide an overview of credit pooling. Credit pooling is a provision which allows manufacturers to use overcompliance in one state to assist with compliance in another state. This concept has been used in our light-duty ZEV regulations, which I'll touch on in a minute. Pooling results in more ZEVs than expected in some areas and less in others, which leads to corresponding changes to emission benefits. To provide some additional context, credit pooling has been used in our Advanced Clean Cars regulations. In the 2012 Advanced Clean Cars regulation, separate East and West regions were established, with California excluded. Manufacturers could freely transfer credits between regions, but faced a 30% premium transferring between the two regions. In the recently adopted Advanced Clean Cars 2 regulation, manufacturers can use excess ZEVs or PHEVs towards meeting a portion of compliance requirements in another state. As shown, this portion declines over time. In addition, pooling can only be used if there's an immediate deficit, cannot be used if there's not an immediate need in a particular state. So in designing a pooling concept, we want to highlight some considerations that we've heard. What are manufacturers seeking through pooling to support a successful rollout of the ACT regulation in multiple states? How can this program be designed so California and each Section 177 state maintains their criteria and greenhouse gas benefits? How to ensure each state's ZEV market grows steadily to support complementary policies, including infrastructure, workforce development, and others? And how to limit complexity and streamline implementation. So following this presentation will be our guest presenters. First will be Tim French with the Truck and Engine Manufacturers Association, and then Rachel Sakata with the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, and Jim Klein with the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. So before I turn it over, I want to highlight the next steps for this rulemaking process. Introducing a pooling concept into the Advancing Trucks regulation will require amendments and board consideration. Staff will also need to determine environmental and economic impacts of this proposal to California. In light of this, we are aiming to finalize this rulemaking by 2025. And if you have any feedback on what we're discussing today, please send to the listed ACT reporting email address. Thanks, and I'll now turn it over to our guest presenters. First, Tim French. So give me a second to get your presentation up, Tim. All right, it should be up.
I see it. So thanks very much, Greg, Tony, and Paul, for putting this workshop together. We greatly appreciate it. It is an element of the Clean Truck Partnership that we entered into in June, which confirms the industry's commitment to work collaboratively with CARB, and in this instance with the opt-in states, to try to maximize the success of CARB's various programs, including ACT. And as an element of that, we believe that credit pooling for the opt-in states, we understand that California probably wants to maintain its own program, but for the opt-in states, we think it could be critical to a successful implementation of the program, and especially in the early years of the program. So next slide, please. So as Paul just pointed out, there are a number of states that have opted into the ACT program. We're including some states that perhaps haven't finalized their opt-ins, but certainly seem to be on the verge of doing so. So we get up to 11 states: Oregon, Washington, Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, Vermont, Maryland, Colorado, New Mexico, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. And of especial import in the near term is several of those states, including those listed here, have opt-ins starting in model year 2025. And for ZEVs, as many of you know, the lead time in terms of ordering would mean that these orders would need to be coming in for planning purposes in 2024. That's next year. Obviously, California has its program starting in 2024. So these issues are imminent, and we hope that we can all work together quickly to implement a credit pooling program to facilitate the implementation of this program. Next slide. Here are the model years that I just referenced, and you can see that in 2025, there are a suite of states proposing to opt in or having opted in for that model year. And again, as I noted, this will initiate, hopefully, a number of purchase orders from these various states starting next year. And so then the other states roll in 2027, and presumably as other states opt in, either they will target 2027 or some later year. And remember that when they opt in, they are opting in at the percentage rates prescribed for that opt-in year under the CARB ACT program. So some states may be opting in when they do so at fairly high penetration rates for ZEVs. Next slide. Here are these penetration rates for ZEVs, as I think were already mentioned. And you'll see for 2025, those numbers don't look too daunting, but compared to where we are today, they are somewhat of a big lift. And then come 2027, when a number of other states are opting in, those numbers become fairly significant. So this is a real challenge. I think we all understand, or many studies would point out that by 2030 or so, the case for BEVs, for fuel cell electric vehicles, in terms of total cost of ownership, become pretty favorable, if not, reaching parity around that 2030 timeframe. So it's in these early years, especially, that some of these targets could be challenging. I mean, obviously, when we get to 100% in 2036, that's a huge challenge. But in any event, for some of these opt-in states, it could be a challenge, especially in these early years when TCO may be real considerations for fleet owners. So the more flexibility we have, I think the better the chances, we think the better the chances are for implementation. Next slide. We've just done some back of the envelope assessments of some of the volumes of ZEVs that we're talking about, ZEV trucks that we're talking about. This is from a report that Ricardo put together when we were commenting on EPA's phase 3 rulemaking. It is looking at the volumes of ZEVs that would be driven in the opt-in states, volume of ZEV sales that would be driven in the opt-in states under EPA's initial proposal in the phase 3 rulemaking. Of note, that proposal was not quite as aggressive as CARB's ACT sales mandates, but still aggressive. And so these are the types of volumes that would be required between the years 2027 and 2032. So these are cumulative numbers in some of the columns. But you'll see how much these numbers vary between the various opt-in states, getting to yearly averages for ZEV sales. If we assume a ramp up from 2027 to 2032, so this does not include the 25, 26 years for some of these states. But you'll just see that these volumes in some cases are quite significant, in others, maybe not as much. But if you think about an OEM trying to manage the differing percentages of the 3 classes of vehicles at these different volume levels in these respective states, it could become complex and in some markets a little bit difficult. So next slide. Here is just a real snapshot. I'm not saying we've done this with true scientific accuracy, but it's just for illustrative purposes. The bottom bars show sales, cumulative sales, and the accumulation of credits in these various opt-in states for ZEV trucks. And then comparing that against the benchmark that we'll have to hit in 2025. And while, as Paul pointed out, there is this pretty significant pool of credits in California and a whole suite of programs in California about funding incentives and infrastructure development. Some opt-in states may not be able to match California's efforts or the accumulation of ZEV credits. And these ZEV credits are across all product categories. So it's not to say that these goals are impossible at all, but they will be challenging. We'll have to work our way through it. But the point is that even in this initial year, from where we are today to where we need to be in very short order, will be a challenge. Next slide. So as I just pointed out, and I'm sorry these slides are so wordy, but as pointed out, the annual sales volumes in some opt-in states could be too low to support separate and distinct ACT deficit credit programs across all 3 categories of heavy-duty vehicles that change in the years. And at the same time, there may be some opt-in states that don't have the infrastructure development or the market readiness, or perhaps some of the incentive programs to spur purchases of ZEV trucks, especially in the initial years when TCO calculations could be problematic for some fleet owners. So that also argues in favor of perhaps flexibility pooling among the opt-in states to allow for sales targeting fleets that are really more ready to go in certain states than perhaps in others. And then this same kind of point, there may be or there may not be sufficient truck buyers in each of the opt-in states, depending on, again, market readiness year over year, at least till we get beyond 2030, to fully implement this program as mandated year over year. The other thing about assessing compliance, manufacturers often don't, OEMs in this case, don't often know where some trucks are going to ultimately end up and be utilized and registered in various states. We keep track of sales by the initial purchase. We have an intention of where the vehicle will be operating. Perhaps a dealer that takes a delivery of a vehicle has an intention of where a vehicle will be operated, but ultimately it's passed on to a third party that's ultimately in control of that. We don't get actual registration data for some trucks until long after the initial sale. It can be even more than a year later. And so when you are assessing year over year compliance in 11 states, the registration data in terms of its timeliness makes it difficult to monitor effectively. That becomes easier if we're dealing with a pooled area of states. Next slide. So as a result, and as others will talk about, and as we've heard from CARB and as an element of our clean truck partnerships, we really feel there's a critical need to be able to utilize a pooled credit program among the opt-in states. Again, it's especially critical in the early years to make sure we can implement this program as smoothly as possible. Without credit pooling, and not to be alarmist, there is an increased risk of product shortages in the opt-in states because manufacturers have committed to comply with ACT. And one way to help ensure that is to reduce the sales of conventionally fueled vehicles, since the sales of ZEVs are calculated as a percentage of that. If an OEM has significant uncertainty about whether vehicles can be sold in an opt-in state at sufficient volumes, or concerns about tracking whether those sales are actually occurring or deliveries are actually occurring in the opt-in states, one way to mitigate non-compliance is to reduce the sale of conventionally fueled vehicles. This is a problem or a compliance option we don't want to be compelled to take advantage of or utilize rather. So here's another reason, let's engage in credit pooling to alleviate that concern and that option as much as we possibly can. We're also wondering whether or not states to date have taken the steps to initiate credit programs already, whether they're in a position to do so. Early credit generation is key, and it's not entirely clear to us whether all the opt-in states have the capacity to start to administer these separate credit programs in effect now. Next slide. So our proposal would be, and it's simple, that we should be allowed in the opt-in states to generate fungible credits. Again, we would treat as under the CARB rule, class 7 and 8 credits would be accounted for separately, but that these credits would be allocated freely among all the opt-in states. Deficits would be generated in an individual opt-in state when an OEM produces and delivers for sale into that opt-in state a conventionally fueled truck. We'd be able to offset that deficit with a credit generated from the sale of a ZEV truck in any of the opt-in states. So in effect, credits would be pooled for allocation among the opt-in states as needed to offset the specific deficits in any opt-in state. So this creates the opportunity where there's over-compliance in a state like New York or New Jersey to help mitigate undercompliance in a state like Vermont or Rhode Island or whatever the case may be. We would need to be able to pool early credits from ZEV truck sales in any opt-in states as well, and that would be starting as soon as possible. Next slide. Credits would not be discounted except as provided under CARB's ACT regulations. We've heard some about discounting of credits under the light duty program. We would hope that given the different volumes, the different capital costs, the different ways that heavy duty vehicles are distributed, the different market shares, that we could maybe avoid some of those discounts to make this program as flexible as possible, especially in the early years. I suppose after 2030, we could refine this a little bit. And to the extent that an OEM might incur fines for non-compliance using hopefully a 3-year averaging period, we would allocate those fines among all the opt-in states on a sales-weighted basis. We would hope that perhaps an independent entity such as NESCOM could help administer this credit pooling program, and we're hopeful that CARB can adopt revisions. We understand that this will require regulatory revisions for such a pooling program among all APC states, with CARB likely exercising its discretion not to opt into the pool. So we understand CARB's desire, the ACT state's desire to keep a CARB program or a CARB pooling concept, and then a program for all the other opt-in states. So that's really kind of where we are, a very basic proposal, and we tried to articulate the reasons why. So Paul, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Tim. So now we'll move on to our other state representatives. We have Rachel from Oregon and Jim from New York. So let me get your slide deck up. Okay, you should be able to see this.
Great, thank you. Good morning. So my name is Rachel Sakata, and I'm the Transportation Strategy Section Manager at the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. And just before we get started, we would like to thank CARB staff for the opportunity to offer the perspective of the Section 177 states today. And we'd also like to thank NESCOM for convening and organizing discussions among the Section 177 states leading up to this workshop. So if you could go to the next slide, please. So states have a long history of exercising their right under Section 177 of the Clean Air Act to adopt California's motor vehicle emissions standards in lieu of federal standards as a way to address air quality problems and climate change. To date, 9 states have adopted the Advanced Clean Trucks, or ACT, regulation, which requires an increasing share of Class 2B to 8 vehicles to be zero-emission vehicles. Notably, the need for pooling was never raised during any of these rulemakings. Another 3 states are in the process of adopting the ACT regulation by the end of this calendar year. And so collectively, these states represent more than a quarter of total heavy-duty vehicle registrations in the United States and a significant share of the medium and heavy-duty vehicle market. Next slide, please. Now, states adopt the ACT regulation for a number of reasons, including to improve air quality by reducing emissions of criteria pollutants like smog-forming NOx and particulate matter that adversely impact public health, to promote equity and justice by reducing these criteria pollutant emissions in frontline and overburdened communities, often located near heavily traveled roadways and freight distribution hubs, to achieve aggressive climate change commitments and targets by reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector, which is the largest source of greenhouse gases in the country and our states, to provide regulatory certainty to ensure states receive increasing volumes of zero-emission trucks, allow for fleets, utilities, and state and local governments to effectively plan and manage the transition to electric trucks, and drive investments in charging and refueling infrastructure, to generate economic growth by attracting public and private sector investments and creating high-quality, well-paying jobs and careers in the clean energy sector, and then to enhance energy security and resilience by reducing dependence on foreign fossil fuels and insulating consumers from volatile market fluctuations. Next slide, please. So while medium and heavy duty trucks only make up 5% of total on-road vehicles, they have an outsized impact on air quality and climate change because they run primarily on diesel engines and log the highest annual vehicle miles traveled of any on-road vehicle type. At nearly 24,000 vehicle miles traveled per year, medium and heavy-duty trucks log more than double the average mileage of light-duty vehicles. Moreover, truck VMT is projected to grow due to the rapid growth in e-commerce and home delivery of consumer goods. Next slide, please. The transportation sector is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the US, accounting for nearly 30% of the nation's greenhouse gas emissions, and medium and heavy-duty vehicles are responsible for a quarter of total greenhouse gas emissions within this sector. In Oregon, the transportation sector accounts for 35% of the state's greenhouse gas emissions, with roughly a quarter of those emissions coming from the medium and heavy-duty vehicles. Next slide, please. So like California, the Section 177 ACT states recognize that decarbonizing the transportation sector is necessary to achieve greenhouse gas reduction targets and mitigate the urgent threats presented by climate change. Our states have committed to substantially reducing or eliminating greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, and many have interim targets that require aggressive emissions reductions by as soon as 2030. Here in Oregon, we are committed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions 45% below 1990 levels by 2035 and 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. Simply put, all pathways to achieving our greenhouse gas reduction targets require switching from fossil fuel vehicles to zero-emission vehicles. And given the urgency of the climate crisis, it is crucial that this transformation accelerates to scale as soon as possible. And now I'd like to turn it over to Jim Klein with the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation.
Great, thank you, Rachel. And thank you, CARB, for allowing us to make a presentation today for Section 177 state's perspective on the concept of pooling within ACT. Medium heavy-duty vehicles are also a very significant source of criteria pollutant emissions. Drawing your attention to the pie chart on the left side here, while heavy-duty vehicles represent only about 5% of the population, they represent about close to 60% of the on-road NOx emissions. Similarly, heavy-duty vehicles represent about 52% of the on-road PM 2.5 emissions. Both NOx and PM 2.5 aggravate cardiovascular respiratory illness, notably asthma, especially to sensitive populations, including children and the elderly. This air pollution leads to increased doctor visits, hospital emergency room visits, lost days at work and school, and it also represents an increased risk of premature death. NOx during warmer temperatures leads to ozone pollution, which has been a very persuasive issue in the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast states. As such, zero-emission vehicles are a necessity for Section 177 states to achieve and maintain the ozone national ambient air quality standards. Next slide, please. But NOx is also a year-round public health concern, including in cold weather. It is just not a summertime ozone issue. NO2 is a criteria pollutant that also affects the respiratory system, and NO2 also contributes to the formation of fine particulate matter. This satellite image taken in the winter clearly shows the contribution of transportation corridors in urban areas to NO2 emissions. We also note, as mentioned earlier, that an increase in truck traffic is expected in the near future. This would further increase truck-related pollution in disadvantaged, frontlined, and overburdened communities. Next slide, please. So many low-income communities and communities of color are located near trucking corridors, ports, and warehouses. They are disproportionately exposed to mobile sources. The following graphic shows the disproportionate impacts specifically related to on-road PM 2.5 exposure. So rather busy slide, so I'll draw your attention to the right side. This stacked bar chart with race demographics shows that the generalized US population represented approximately 62% of white people. The researchers behind this graphic then evaluated census tract data based on PM 2.5 exposure. I'll draw your attention to the far left column. This represents the lowest PM 2.5 exposure. And as it indicates here, about 74% of this census information shows a white population. As we progress left to right, the PM 2.5 exposure increases to when we get to the far right column, which represents the most PM 2.5 exposure. It represents a white population of 39%. Clearly, non-white residents are disproportionately exposed to PM 2.5 emissions compared to the national average. On-road PM emissions are also very pervasive public health threats, along with social inequities. It is critical to transition to zero-emission trucking as soon as possible, as the ACT regulation will result in significant PM, NOx, and mobile source air toxic reductions. Next slide, please. The ACT ZEB sales requirement clearly provides regulatory certainty. Another way of saying it, it provides stability. It creates market certainty, not only for vehicle manufacturers, but also fleets, utilities, and state and local governments as we transition to medium and heavy duty ZEVs. Of note, state regulators base utility programs around this certainty through make-ready programs, fleet assessment programs, alternative rate structures, and also new vehicle purchase incentives. For example, in New York State, our make-ready program was recently revised to increase the statewide make-ready budget to $1.24 billion, of which the medium and heavy-duty make-ready budget was more than doubled, increasing to $58 million. Our Public Service Commission is currently conducting a proceeding to address barriers to medium and heavy-duty zero-emission vehicle charging infrastructure. Clearly, these efforts are crucial to support the future of truck electrification. Next slide, please. Section 177 concerns about potential ACT pooling. Section 177 states, could potentially see fewer zero-emission vehicles than anticipated when we adopted the ACT regulation. This could slow down the needed reductions of criteria pollutants and make it more difficult to meet the ozone national ambient air quality standard. It could also result in the loss of public health benefits, especially in overburdened communities. It also impedes state efforts to promote equity and justice. It could diminish the urgent need for each state's commitments and statutory requirements to reduce in-state greenhouse gas emissions. In short, it's unclear how pooling would benefit Section 177 states, as it could create regulatory uncertainty. Next slide, please. As previously noticed, the ACT regulation already includes existing flexibilities. Early action credits can be earned before the regulation goes into place, and this varies by time. As indicated earlier, in New York, for example, early compliance credits could be generated as soon as the 2022 model year, while the ACT ZEV sales requirements do not begin until model year 2025. ACT can include some traditional flexibilities, including banking of credits and trading of credits. Near zero emission vehicles may also fulfill up to 50% of annual deficits. Credits can be used interchangeably to meet the non-tractor deficits. There's also low tractor volume, and low volume flexibility provided to manufacturers. Under the original ACT adoption, annual deficits may be carried forward for 1 year. And we note that this is being changed to 3 years as part of the Clean Trucks Partnership. The underlying concern in 177 states is that pooling could water down ACT sales requirements. Flexibility already exists. It is imperative as a first step to determine whether pooling is warranted at all. Any pooling concept needs to consider the concerns raised here today by the Section 177 states. Thank you for the opportunity to share the Section 177 state perspectives and our concerns.
Okay, thank you. And that concludes our presentations for this morning. So right now, I think we have scheduled for open Q&A. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to raise your hand using the Zoom raise hand function, and we'll call on questions received in the order. So I think Molly's taking the hands raised. Is that right? Or
Yeah, that's right.
okay,
So
go.
Urvi Nagrani, I see that you have your hand up. Let's see. Huh. I only have the option to, I don't have the option to unmute.
Oh, someone might need to promote Molly to a panelist. I'll unmute her. So Urvi should be able to speak right now. Go ahead.
Hey there. I definitely feel like what the other states have been saying is incredibly important. The fact is that credit pooling doesn't help the air quality reason for most climate action. And while many people want climate action for climate's sake, a lot of people only want climate action for its air quality benefits. And so I think any pooling should be narrowly defined so that the air quality benefits can be more localized, because that localized air quality benefit is key to the political support and future of the program. I understand that from CARB's perspective, there is regulatory certainty by getting all of the manufacturers on board and going along with a pooling scenario. And I think that can't be overlooked. So there should be some pooling, but in a very narrow way. And I think the other thing is that, as we've already seen in California, where there hasn't been as much difficulty to meet those targets, a more stringent target would be necessary to make pooling really a rational choice, I think, because fundamentally we aren't going to hit our climate targets with weaker half measures, and we really need to.
Thank you for the feedback. I'm not seeing any other hands raised. Okay, we have one. So Greg Herner, I've given you permission to speak. If you could unmute yourself and begin.
Yeah, Greg Herner on behalf of Miller Industries. I just want to, I'm not going to repeat my comments from the earlier workshop. You're well aware of those, but I would point back to those comments to support the pooling concept and extending the availability of credits over a longer period of time. As discussed, we're already experiencing issues of having chassis available for industries that don't have a near ZEV or a ZEV technology development that exists right now, and those could create are likely to create shortages even in 2024. And so it's critical that we provide as much flexibility in the rule as possible so that we can continue to service those industries that still need ICU engines until the technology further develops. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. And while we wait for more people to raise their hands, just want to remind them, this is a kickoff workshop. This is going to be a full rulemaking process. We do really appreciate all the feedback that people provide over this. So yeah, start a lot of conversations as we try to nail down the best proposal. Okay, see, Kevin Brown has his hand raised. I'll give you permission to speak. Kevin, you could unmute yourself and begin.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, thank you. I mean, there's a couple of variables I can think of that need to be considered, or how others might consider them. One is that in the, let's say, just the Northeast states, where the population density is very high and land is largely developed, that it may take longer to get infrastructure in place for vehicles. The other one that comes to my mind is that how do you address a state that on a per capita basis just isn't spending what other states are spending to get these technologies in place?
Thank you for the comment. I'm not sure if any of our panelists want to respond, or we can just take that back and think about that. Okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Paul. I think I missed the question.
And Kevin, could you, I guess, repeat, and if you give your affiliation, that'll also be appreciated. You should be able to speak, Kevin.
Don't hear me?
Yes.
Okay. It's Kevin Brown with Make It Clean Mobility. And the 2 points I raised, Tim, were, how do you, the pooling has to be able to address a lot of factors, more than just the ones I'm raising, but 2 I raised were, that in some areas, like in the US Northeast, it's high population density. A lot of the, fleets, the infrastructure has to go through areas that are already fully developed. And so it presents a greater difficulty in getting infrastructure in. So that's one element that I raised, is how do you incorporate that with respect to pooling? The other one is that, how do you address, let's say, a state that just isn't spending on a per capita basis what other states are spending to help fleets get the technology in place?
So I think we endorse those concerns. Part of the reason for pooling is the fact that some states are ahead of others, and yet all the states have the same mandates in terms of percentages. As I tried to say, certainly prior to 2030, there are significant concerns about infrastructure readiness. In fact, that's why Maryland's opt-in proposal includes an upfront feasibility study or infrastructure readiness study to make sure that they are, in fact, ready from an infrastructure point of view, and specifically a heavy-duty BEV charging point of view to implement the program, and that they figured out what kind of per vehicle incentives will be necessary to spur purchases until TCO calculations prove out, which we think is probably in the 2030 and beyond timeframe. So these are key considerations. In a state like New York may be ahead of a state like Rhode Island, or any of the other states. A state like Oregon may be, further ahead in planning because they've been thinking about this for longer than a state like Connecticut or what have you. So because of the disparate nature of readiness, that's why we think pooling helps. You can, again, obviously the mechanism, you over comply in one area to allow for credit utilization in another. There were a couple other points that I'd just like to touch on real briefly. There was a note that, hey, this concern was never raised in the underlying rulemakings. At least on EMA's part, we did include this concern in our written comments. So folks, those written comments are fairly extensive, but it's in there if folks want to go back and look that up. The other thing that folks mentioned is that, hey, we really need these programs because of legitimate air quality concerns. We don't dispute that. But what we would say is that, starting now under California's program, conventionally fueled vehicles need to be much, much cleaner. And very soon under EPA's program, which has a pull ahead in 2026, NOx emissions will be initially 0.05 down from 0.2 and ultimately down to 0.035. So those, conventionally fueled vehicles on their own are getting much, much cleaner, and the PM profile for these vehicles is less than 001 really, triple zero, fill in a number. I mean, they are addressed. They're not ZEVs, but they're better than what is existing, and certainly better than the fleet mix that was shown in that satellite photo from 2019. The other point is that credit pooling doesn't mean that less ZEVs are being sold, or that the generation of credits, the sales, the oversales in some states means that collectively the same number of vehicles are being sold, as if to the same extent that would be if the program were fully implemented in all of the states. It's just the fact that that's probably not feasible to do those sales in all the states. So we need pooling. And finally, the question is raised, hey, what's in it for us if we're an opt-in state? Well, as a practical matter, and not to be doomsday about it, is that, again, as I pointed out, if there's concerns about market readiness, infrastructure readiness, incentive readiness in many of these states, if fleets in some of the states can't step up to the plate to buy, the only sure way for a manufacturer to comply in the opt-in states is to reduce the sale of conventionally fueled vehicles, so your ZEV sales mandates get lower and lower and lower. We are trying to overcome those same dynamics in California through the Clean Trucks Partnership. And so anyway, were that to occur in the opt-in state, fleet turnover to get to these cleaner vehicles that I just pointed to can slow a lot. And therefore older vehicles stay on the road longer, which is directly contrary to what we all want to accomplish. So credit pooling, yeah, it doesn't implement the program as originally modeled in the opt-in states. But frankly, for some of these opt-in states, that's not going to happen. So we have to deal with the reality of the differing readiness of the states. We want to work with the opt-in states. Maybe this could have a timeline to it, as I pointed out, after 2030 something, this program could dissipate in one way or the other. But between now and when TCO becomes real, this is a real thing that we need to address.
Hey, Paul, can I just make one quick comment? This is Rachel from Oregon.
Go ahead.
I think one of the things that I heard mentioned was just, about state readiness with regards to this regulation. And yes, I think states are in different areas in terms of readiness, but I also think that, with those states that have adopted ACT, as we mentioned in our presentation, it gives regulatory certainty that the ZEV trucks will be coming to our state. We're going to see these benefits. We want to see them coming to us. In Oregon alone, since the adoption of ACT, we've received funding from our legislature to move forward with medium and heavy duty vehicle rebates. We've also received funding to set up medium and heavy duty infrastructure. We're working really closely with our utilities. So I think, with the adoption of ACT, it kind of moves the state forward even more to make sure that there is the ability for us to bring the zero emission vehicles to our state, to be able to help support the fleets, to make sure that barriers are broken down so that they can put in charging, they can do the planning that's necessary. So I think that I think, like I said, the regulatory certainty kind of brings that element to it, and then it kind of helps push the state a little bit more forward into making sure that we'll get those ZEVs, that we have all the elements in place that's needed to move forward, and that we're going to get those trucks in our state so that our populations can see the benefits of those cleaner trucks that are operating within our state.
Rachel, quick question. Do you know how many ZEV trucks have been sold in Oregon to generate early credits?
I don't know offhand. I'd have to go take a look at the database.
Okay.
And Paul, this is Kevin Brown here. Can I make one more point?
Sure.
Sure, okay. Again, it's Kevin Brown, Make It Clean Mobility. I think I heard it was James Klein that had the comment that some states may be wanting to implement the zero emissions trucks as a way to address air quality concerns. And I forget his exact wording, but I wanted to make this one point that depending upon the local grid emissions intensities, and they vary, that in any event, you're going to find that a new diesel truck that's complying with the latest regulations is also going to offer a tremendous benefit, and in some places potentially a greater benefit than the zero emissions truck. It is dependent on the grid. The example I'll give you is if you've got a fleet on Long Island, New York, that's a high emissions grid, and there, the diesel truck is likely to actually outperform the zero emissions truck with respect to emissions. So in any event, I want to say with regards to air quality, whether it's a zero emissions truck or it's a brand new truck, I mean, we've got to really focus on both things, on making that transition to zero emissions, but also turning over the fleets, the oldest trucks in the fleets to new trucks.
Go ahead, James. Is your hands up on our side?
Yes, thanks. Yes, Jim Klein again. So, the example that was given with the Long Island grid, we also have goals to renewable energy goals in our Climate Act. So over time, the New York State electrical grid is going to dramatically decrease in emissions. Example I'll use in counter to the point made earlier is our upstate electrical grid currently is one of the cleanest electrical grids in the country. So I don't think that same argument holds true as the example that was presented. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Okay, so Molly should be able to raise and lower her hand, so I guess
Yes.
either way, Molly.
Go ahead. Laurel Moorhead, I have your hand up. You can speak.
Hi, my name's Laurel Moorhead and I represent Transfer Flow. And so I wanted to pinball a little bit off of a couple earlier comments I heard. So according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, the EIA, the current average NOx nationwide is 0.74 pounds per megawatt. And when you convert that into grams of brake horsepower hour, that comes out to 0.25. So like a couple other people said, that's high, like far more than the NOx you're going to get from a new diesel engine meeting the new regulations. The EPA 2027 limits for NOx are 0.035. So that diesel is far cleaner than the electric grid. And so I saw in your slide earlier where you said 27% of emissions comes from transportation and 25 comes from electricity generation. But have you done an analysis to see how much the emissions are going to increase when you increase the grid and you increase that electricity generation? Because just because you're putting zero emissions doesn't mean that you're decreasing those emissions. You're just converting them from tailpipe emissions to electricity generation emissions. And also the argument that the electricity grid is going to get cleaner. Well, that's kind of a false argument because technology, internal combustion engine technology is also getting cleaner. So you need to, if you want to say the future electricity grid is this clean, then you have to say future trucks are also this clean. You can't say, oh, future electricity grid is being compared to previous year's ICEs. That's a false argument. And so my second question is, CARB has repeatedly over and over and over refused to conduct a life cycle emission analysis. And I want to ask if that's short-sighted and if maybe that should be done to get an actual, like what is actually best for the climate? Because it's not necessarily all going electricity. I think the highest electricity grid in the nation is in Alaska at 2.2 grams per brake per hour. And in DC, District of Columbia, it's 1.9. And then if we want to get into carbon emissions, when we say California's electricity grid is currently running about 78 to 81 grams of CO2 emissions per megawatt of energy. when you look into like technologies like renewable natural gas, like those have like -400 carbon emissions. So even when you have these piddly little carbon emissions coming out of the tailpipe, they far outweigh the emissions from making the electricity compared to like renewable natural gas. And Cummins makes a great renewable natural gas engine. So I'm not sure why those other technologies are not being ramped up to meet people's needs, where there's a lot of applications where electricity is a poor fit, such as snowplow removals, tow trucks, firefighting equipment for wildland firefighting. And so I just think that the regulation really is short-sighted, and it's not going to roll out the way that you would think it's going to. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Laura.
Oh, go ahead. Paul.
I guess, I guess just in response to the first portion about how we look at these emission analyses, I think for when we try to look at basically what is defined by statute, regulations, and other legislation. So, for example, how we look at ICE engines, we are looking at the actual standards adopted. So when we talk about combustion engines, we look at what we're expecting from both California's omnibus regulation as well as the federal Clean Truck Plan to show that we do anticipate that these engines will get cleaner over time. And on the electricity grid, California, like many of the other states who've adopted the ACT regulation, has set legislation to require that the state's electricity grids will move to renewable, zero carbon, zero emission technologies such as solar, wind, and others. So we are trying to look at basically looking for what is the most accurate expectation of what the grid will be, just to make sure that we can accurately look at these emission benefits in the future. So that's, I guess, do you have anything on the other questions? I don't think I caught all of them.
Oh, sorry. Next, I
Go ahead.
accidentally removed her permissions. I thought we were moving on. Irving Greeny, I have unmuted your mic. You may begin.
Hi, I just wanted to strongly urge CARB to ignore any sort of bad faith arguments. I think a lot of times we end up with regulatory delays because of those sorts of things. Right now, there is about to begin a climate summit in Dubai, specifically talking about the impact of methane emissions. And one of the things that we have heard in pretty much every CARB work group meeting that I have attended since 2014 is how low NOx engines are coming and they're so much cleaner and the market will use these things. And we still have a huge sale of diesel engines that are not those engines. And none of those criticisms ever account for the fact that those methane emissions still exist, and methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. And so, the reason for not going into a heavy trading state for local populations tends to be, what is the impact of clean air? But if you were to say, let's pretend this is entirely because of climate, let's go with the most efficient thing, we should not include any sort of weakening that would enable methane emissions, which are a more potent greenhouse gas, to increase at the cost of carbon emissions. I think fundamentally, both of these drivers are incredibly important. And we've seen from political leaders in all of these states that nobody wants these to be weakened. So the only way that a credit trading should happen is if it will address, for example, utility issues as opposed to manufacturing issues. Like if there's a shortage of chassis and that is the reason that people say, oh, we can't have electric, well, then maybe you should change your inventory towards electric instead of putting those same chassis to work in a low NOx engine. This is a choice that manufacturers have, and weakening the regulatory guidelines because of, for example, a lack of incentives isn't a very wise choice, because all programs, there is a carrot phase where there's lots of incentives to do the right thing. And then there's the regulatory phase, which is here comes the stick. You didn't act early enough. Fundamentally, we are trying to leave the carrot phase in California. We're cutting incentive amounts. We're reducing the size of programs. We're adding income caps. We are meant to be going into a phase where we don't need those incentives because the regulations are pushing the market forward. If we weaken that and the market isn't pushed forward because of the way that we enable credit trading, then fundamentally we will stay in a place where there's nobody telling you you have to do the right thing. And we have already begun to dismantle some of those incentives at the state level. Now, we do have plenty of incentives at a federal level. We have tax breaks for the manufacturers, for the equipment that goes into some of this equipment, for the manufacturing process itself, and for the customer. I think any sort of good faith argument needs to acknowledge that now we are in the phase where regulatory sticks are called for.
Thank you, Irby. Next in line to speak is Mark Miller. Mark, can you please state your affiliation and begin to ask your question? Thank you. Mark jumped off. Okay, Tom Van Heek, I have, you may unmute your mic and speak now, Tom.
Thanks, Molly. Hey, Tom Van Heeke with Rivian Automotive. Thanks, Carb, for putting this together, and thanks to the speakers and presenters today. This is obviously an important and interesting conversation, and we look forward to future discussions and workshops on this, because I think there's a lot to think about here as we consider how to manage potential risks and how to design something like this, if that's what Carb likes to do. On that note, I think just a couple of comments initially for me. One is, it certainly seems to me that it will be useful to have some kind of robust modeling of compliance implications of a pooling provision under the program. Maybe that's a job for CARB, maybe it's somebody else, but I think that's going to be important, paying particular attention, I think, to the distinction between 7/8 tractor and the rest of the market. I noticed, Tim, that you presented some data on 7/8 tractor, but not the rest of the market. We're certainly seeing rapid progress in electrifying at least 2B3. That's going to have important implications for compliance, at least in sort of the 2 through 8 side of the market that's not tractor sales. I think we need to pay attention to that. And on a related note, no discussion yet today that I heard about how ACF feeds into this, at least in California. Again, something that we need to consider. That may be an additional argument for, if CARB moves forward with a pooling provision, some kind of walling off of the California market from other states, given that ACF is going to create, I think, unique incremental volume in the state above and beyond what ACT requires, and allowing those credits to pool out could have additional sort of downside impacts for the 177 states that we heard so much about today. So just a couple of comments and initial reactions. Looking forward to more thought and discussion on this. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Tom. Next in line to speak is Todd Campbell. Todd, I've opened your mic. Can you ask your comment?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good morning. I just want to thank the California Resources Board and the other state agencies for pulling this workshop together. Clearly, we support whatever you think is best in terms of proceeding and making sure that a zero-emission pathway is more feasible. And quite frankly, I've been listening to the debate today and haven't really thought much, or haven't had enough time to think about what we would support. But I did want to respond real quickly to Ms. Negrani's comments, because they're just flat out wrong. And I just want to point out that CARB's 2022 analysis of progress toward achieving the 2030 dairy and livestock sector methane emissions targets shows the critical role that state incentive programs played in scaling investment to achieve methane emission reductions from the dairy and livestock sector, and also identified a potential path to achieve the SB 1383 targets through continued implementation of incentive funding through the California Department of Agriculture's Dairy Digester Research and Development Program and Alternative Manure Management Program, in combination with enteric mitigation strategies when feasible. And CARB's low carbon fuel standard has also played a key role in incentivizing dairy digester projects by encouraging the use and production of cleaner, low carbon transportation fuels in California, thereby reducing greenhouse gas emissions and decreasing petroleum dependence in the transportation sector. The LCFS also supports achieving the state's climate, air quality, and zero emission transportation goals. For example, LCFS has incentivized significant deployment of biofuels in the medium and heavy duty sector to reduce criteria air pollutants, and has contributed to the build out of EV charging and hydrogen fuel dispensers for fuel cell vehicles. While dairy biomethane is currently being used to displace diesel fuel use in medium and heavy duty trucks powered by low NOx trucks engines, in California, we're also pursuing increasing levels of ZEV deployment to further reduce transportation, GHG, and criteria pollutant emissions. CARB recently adopted the scoping plan update, the Clean Truck Partnership, and the Advanced Clean Fleets Regulation, all of which clarify the importance of electrification and ZEV development, including the medium and heavy-duty truck sector. Biomethane can also be used as a hydrogen feedstock for electricity end uses and for displacing fossil gas and other hard to decarbonize sectors. Those aren't my words. Those actually the words from CARB to an assembly member who inquired about the use of biomethane. So when someone says, puts out terms like the boogeyman of we need to reduce methane, the use of RNG actually in transportation is reducing methane. So I just wanted to take a little bit issue to that. Otherwise, I really appreciate everyone participating today, and I'm looking forward to contributing positively to the process.
Well, thanks, Todd. So next in line to speak is Alex Cervenka. Alex, I've unmuted your mic. You may speak.
All right, good morning. And my name is Alex Cervenka. I'm the zero emission sales manager over at Kenworth Truck Company. For those of us who don't know us, we manufacture Class 6 through Class 8 vehicles. We do have battery electric for those classes, and we are also working on bringing out a fuel cell electric vehicle in the Class 8 space. And I just want to give some color kind of from the front lines of the zero emissions vehicle fight, of which we are very supportive of. So again, thank you to CARB for having us here and kind of taking the time with us. But what we're really seeing out in the field here is that, and again, this is just to kind of level set for everybody who may not be aware of it, but when you look at the vehicle cost compared to diesel vehicles, a battery electric vehicle off the bat is going to be about 3 times more expensive. Fuel cell electric vehicle is about 4.5 times more expensive than a comparable diesel. So just wanted to get that out there, that there is a very real price increase to the end users. And then you also have to factor in the infrastructure cost and the timeline delays. And this isn't to point fingers at any utilities or anything like that, but a lot of fleets and smaller customers that I've been meeting with over the past 3 years are trying to do this. They are trying to comply, but at the end of the day, it is a business that they operate, so they have to make sure that they are able to stay in business. So what I'm kind of getting at there is that the added vehicle cost and then the infrastructure cost and the timelines of the infrastructure build out are really, they're kind of keeping us a little bit hamstrung. We're kind of still in the phase where we need more carrots and less sticks. I'm not saying that we should necessarily change the stick approach, but incentives being pulled early from larger fleets that can have more of an outsized impact on the goal of reducing emissions, I think was a bit nearsighted. If you look at the vehicle life cycle, it's typically in our industry a version of a powertrain, or a truck or tractor could stay on the road for about, or stay on the marketplace for about 5 years, just to kind of stay profitable, kind of stay where we are still designing for the life cycle of a vehicle. It's a good bit longer than the passenger car market. So that's another thing I want folks to kind of keep in mind when we're looking at how quickly you can iterate and bring out new technologies. So I think what we need to kind of keep in mind when we're talking about credit pooling and all this is that we just want to get more of these zero emission vehicles out there. We truly do. We're doing everything in our power to do so. And I think there are just factors outside of a lot of folks' control, mainly cost and infrastructure availability, that are kind of really limiting factors. I want to see as many of these zero emission vehicles out there And we've been working really hard in California to do so, since that's kind of the first state with ACT regulations coming up. But when we have utility companies telling our customers, we can get you power for your one charger in 3 years, that kind of kills the deal immediately there. And that has really impacted our ability to hit a lot of these targets. So I think having some flexibility as far as the timing of the credit pooling, and then also being able to, just pool credits in general. I mean, we've seen it work with the low carbon fuel standard credit system. I think that credit pooling doesn't necessarily dilute the impact of bringing zero emission vehicles to market. If anything, it will kind of help other fleets see success stories, help other states see success stories, and then just really increase the adoption of zero emission vehicles. So again, just a couple of comments there that I wanted to make, and just make sure that we're all kind of level set as far as the timelines and costs of some of these vehicles. Thank you.
Thank you, Alec. Next in line to speak is Mark Miller. Mark, I've unmuted your mic. You may comment.
So I just wanted to comment about this discussion around regulatory certainty. And I want to remind people that this regulatory certainty really is only that the vehicles will be available, right? It's not giving you any certainty that you'll get a specific number of zero emission vehicles sold within your state, because it's really only saying that you're going to get a certain percentage of the vehicles that are sold within that state for a specific model year. Okay. So if we do need to reduce the sales of our diesel vehicles into a state so that we can assure that we're compliant, then that's just going to really reduce the number of ZEVs that you're going to get in total. All right. And I also want to come back to something that Jim Klein said regarding the Make Ready program in New York. And it's great to hear that these funds have been approved and increased, actually. But what's concerning is that, you're talking about in excess of $1 billion that are available, but only 58 million of that is available for heavy duty. So we need to accelerate the infrastructure investments in each of these states. A $58 million infrastructure investment, unfortunately, isn't going to really get us where we need to be. So I would like to get the list of concerns that Jim put up, so that we can, start looking at those as soon as possible and trying to come back with some responses and solutions. But this is going to be a very difficult regulation to meet, especially in the states that are somewhat isolated and that don't have significant levels of investment. But we're definitely willing to work with those states to try and meet the requirements. So that's all I had to say. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I'm sorry, you forgot to state your affiliation earlier. Would you mind doing it now?
Yeah, I apologize. It's Mark Miller. I'm with Volvo Group. So
Volvo. Mac Volvo. Thank you. And Mark, you had also mentioned something about wanting the list, one of the presentations, and we will be posting them on our website. So soon. I'll post that in the chat, our website in the chat.
Okay.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, Mark, thank you. I guess for completeness, I'd like to mention that the recent increase was due to a midpoint review, which was required. That's not to say that, additional changes will happen in the future. We actually have an ongoing proceeding right now, specifically on medium and heavy duty charging. And my last point will be is that, the ZEV sales requirement under ACT does not start in New York until the 2025 model year. So that's $58 million that's available before the actual sales requirements. And I realize it takes time to install infrastructure. Thank you.
I don't see anyone else with their hands up. Paul.
Yeah, same. So I guess we'll give a last call, and just we do recognize this. There are a lot of questions about what this pooling concept will look like, and we're looking forward to working with all the stakeholders to help iron this out in the future. Yeah, so this will be the beginning of a process. So we look forward to engaging with everyone. So I still don't see any hands. Oh, looks like we got one.
Sorry, Aaron Crowell. Aaron, you have your hand up. I'm gonna open your mic. We should be able to. Hi.
Thank you, Molly. Thank you, Paul. One thing that hasn't been discussed much in this workshop that I think future workshops needs to discuss potentially is the reporting and monitoring compliance for all the parties and states involved. If we choose not to do credit pooling, then the number of or the complexity of the reporting and monitoring compliance gets very challenging. For example, if one state interprets some of the ACT regulation differently in terms of how credits are computed or debits are computed or when certain things are allowed or not allowed, it could create situations where the OEMs or the regulatees don't know how to handle that for each and every state that does it differently. So I wonder what could be done to try to prevent that from happening so that we don't have a certain understanding with one state and a completely different understanding with the other state. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. And can you give your name and your affiliation?
Yeah, sorry, I'm with PACCAR.
Thank you. Yeah, so I can just provide a little bit of context. Right now, for the Advanced Clean Trucks regulation, we've set up our own reporting system, the Advanced Clean Trucks Reporting System, or ACTRS. That's meant to provide a single portal for each manufacturer to submit their data for every Advanced Clean Truck state and allow each state to access the same portal to view information about their own state sales. So we have tried to make sure that we can have a centralized system to ease complexity for everyone, and we are looking to keep that moving forward as we move into this pooling concept, making sure that the implementation will work for both the manufacturers reporting as well as the states who are actually implementing the provisions. And
so are you saying that the OEMs would only report into the ACT reporting that's required to CARB, and then CARB will share that information with all the states that are participating?
I believe that's how we're doing it now. Someone correct me if that's not right.
Yeah, this is Tony. I'll weigh in. Yeah, so we've got a shared system that any state can use that adopts the rule. So all the calculations are essentially identical based on where the sale actually occurred. And so that we'll continue to maintain that with any changes to allow there to be one, consistency across the board. And then two, I mean, this is where the key is on any modifications we make is getting the language as clear as possible. So we minimize any areas of debate and confusion is obviously one of our goals. So as we move forward, we'll be looking to everyone to help participate on making sure it's like, all right, if this isn't so clear, let's add some definitions and so on. We're actually making some modifications at the moment into the rule that the minor modifications, if you will, that are simply looking to reduce questions and uncertainty. So we'll continue to do that.
Thank you. So a quick follow-up question on that would be, so for example, early adoption years, are all opt-in states using the exact same starting early adoption year of 2021? Or does that vary from state to state? And
I do know that does vary based on what's already been adopted, as in many cases when a state is adopting the requirement, as you've kind of heard, and I think Tim went over, there's different implementation start dates in terms of when the requirements start based on when the state might have adopted the rule. And there is often a different start date in terms of the credit and how that's treated. And that's going to vary by state. I don't know if anybody can add more to that.
Yeah, that does vary by state, Aaron. Typically, states allow for early credit generation 2 years before their implementation date. Some states go back a little further, but it does vary state by state.
the variability there is, sort of looking at, are you counting credits in 2021 or not, or some of those kind of things where, so while there is a technical difference, there may not be a really large amount of vehicles that were sold in the particular model years that are already behind us that would be in question for that. So it may not be as big a difference as it might appear.
Yeah, true. I agree.
And that was Bill Robertson, our vehicle program specialist in our heavy duty combustion and zero emission programs.
Thank you. I was just bringing that up as a point to try to highlight that it's not always clear to us when that happens, and some may know the answer, some may not, but it's not necessarily clear. So anything that can be done to help highlight all of that for everyone so that it's known would be great. Thank you.
Thanks, Aaron. We do have another hand raised from Manoj Bhagwat. Manoj, I've unmuted your mic. You may comment. Hold on. He should be able to unmute himself.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, this is Manoj from Packard Corporate, and this is the extension of what Aaron Prowl say. Packard will be happy to contribute when the credit reporting any system is developed so that it will be effectively implemented. So our request is that it will be helpful that if you count us for when any reporting and tracking system is created and developed.
Oh, okay. So yeah, so let me just go back a little. So we do have a reporting system, and each manufacturer can go in and upload or update their information individually, and they can also see the total sales that they've reported and the credits and the results of the calculation. So that's in place. So any changes that we make, we would make to that common shared system. And for anybody who's interested, as we kind of mentioned, it's a manufacturer can upload their sales for different states at different with different uploads, but they can also actually submit all the data in a single file for all the states to just ease reporting, and it'll be available to the individual state representatives.
Yeah, and I can just add that our agency working in ESCOM does have a lot of experience on the light duty side, just implementing a pooling system to streamline flexibility. And we'll definitely be trying to take lessons learned from the light duty side and make sure we can keep things smooth on the heavy duty side as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. I don't see any more hands raised. So any closing remarks?
Okay, well, thank you all for joining this morning. So this is going to be, we want to make sure we can work with both manufacturers and states to get this right. So we'll be working with all parties to make sure that we can incorporate feedback and work on a proposal that will be feasible for everyone. So this is not our only workshop today. At I think 12:30, we'll be having another workshop this afternoon focused on discussing the role of hydrogen internal combustion in California's advancing trucks and advancing fleets regulations. So just a heads up if you're interested in that too.
Oh, just a correction real quick, Paul, sorry. It starts at noon, so.
At noon, okay. Thank you for that. And with that, I think we will sign off. Thanks everyone, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you all. Thanks for organizing this. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.